Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions that archaeologists in the Middle East make to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and I'm joined by two special guests, Dr. Kendra Holowiak-Valentine, Professor of New Testament Studies at La Sierra University, and playing a bit of administrative roles here and there as well.
True these
which
days.
you love dearly, or you'd rather be teaching all the time?
I enjoy teaching very much.
Okay. Nicely and diplomatically and administratively spoken. Very nicely done. Kent Bramlett is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity at La Sierra, archaeologist, an associate director of the center, somebody that we have, that I have known for many years. He reminds me of some of the things I said 20, no, 30, no.
We figured it out. It was somewhere between those.
It's between those numbers.
Wow.
So anyway, this has been great, thinking about the Bible and archaeology together,
Yes.
in the hopes that by doing so, maybe the world of the biblical time period, now we're thinking about the time of Jesus, that the world might come alive, that we might sense something maybe new and different as we seek to enter into the Roman period in Palestine. We are thinking now about Jerusalem. Connotations of we finally made it to Jerusalem, or there's some sadness coming, or how do we think about that in the context of the life of Jesus?
It's kind of a mixture, isn't it? Jesus has, for quite a few chapters of the Gospels by now, said, I'm headed to Jerusalem, I'm headed to Jerusalem. By the way, I'm headed to Jerusalem. So we've been anticipating it if we're following the narrative, but yet we know what that means as well.
Certainly from Caesarea Philippi and the
Right.
encounter with the disciples, the conversations with the disciples.
Who do you say that I am? That scene is where Jesus first says, I'm headed to Jerusalem.
I'm headed. Kent, Jerusalem, you've spent quite a bit of time in Jerusalem.
Right. I lived there for a while, went to university on the Mount of Olives, or Mount Scopus. It's a place with so many layers of history. I never get tired of spending time in that area. But with these events, of course, one thinks of the momentous significance of it in the Gospels and the connections that we can make. There are layers and layers of tradition, but if we peel back some of those, we can find sites, sort of pegs that we can attach fairly strong connections with those actual events.
Now, were you talking about the archaeological peeling back of layers? Because most of Roman Jerusalem is what, on average, how far below what where we visit, where people go down the Via Dolorosa? How much farther down would one typically need to go to get to Roman Jerusalem?
Right, or the Christian Quarter Road. I mean, the 8-10 feet down, I think, are the Roman levels, and some of the gates. You know, the Damascus Gate is much later, but underneath that is the Roman Gate. So sure, it's layered literally, but also with layers of tradition. And I guess I was thinking about that aspect.
Yeah. What we're doing for this episode is thinking about Jerusalem pre-Passion, the last week of Jesus' life. So we actually need to think about something quite a bit earlier, as in right after the birth narratives, and of course the visit of Jesus with his family. So we'll be thinking a little bit about that, but we'll think about some of these locations, not tied to the Passion, but certainly tied to Roman period Jerusalem, and hopefully in the process kind of visualize something more. I mean, the real way to do this is to go, right? Is to visit, is to immerse oneself in the country and in the city, and in the process. I've always said that I could not read the Bible the same way after my first trip, because there was so much there which then triggered more imagination and which kind of secured it in a way that just reading it could never do. So it was very moving. In Jerusalem, of course.
And the geographical layout, once you see how the sites relate, where Bethany is, where these places that we know so well by name, but to see how you can walk between them.
Right.
in an hour, in half an hour.
Right, so we're going to do that. But before we do that, before we walk through Jerusalem, we need to take a quick look at what's on the table in front of us. And we have some artifacts of different materials, mostly, I guess, all of glass or ceramic.
Here's the glass. Certainly glass preserves its contents very well. It's non-porous, so you don't have to worry about valuable ingredients leaking out, perfumes evaporating, as they would slowly from the clay vessels. These are largely vessels that came from tombs. So again, part of the last rites, you would anoint the body as the disciples wanted to do for Jesus, especially the women were concerned about that aspect of it. And they've been preserved. They represent, again, the artisanry of the Roman craftspeople that created these, and represent quite a wide range of uses, from storage vessels like this one, to other types of vessels that would have been valuable not just to the elite, but maybe to the middle class as well, and yet for special occasions.
Would glass be used, if at all? I was going to think often, or if at all, for food consumption. This what you've described seems to be quite different from that.
Right, I don't believe so.
So then we go to ceramics for that. And that's what we have on the rest of the table here, including a couple of vessels here with the typical ribbing from the Roman period that would be used for liquids of some kind, jars, jugs, and then a special vessel of some kind, probably used in, some kind of worship setting, because maybe with a libation, a liquid offering, pouring into the one place and then pouring it out through the small spout, and another small spouted jar with holes in the top so that whatever you put in there is going to take a lot of jostling and you're not going to lose it. So it's quite mobile. A couple of really elegant vessels here, probably for perfumes, oils, unguents, something like that, that would not take a large opening. In fact, this one, the one on the right for viewers, has a very small opening and a small capacity as well. So probably different uses for these two, and then a couple of nice small bowls. What would bowls? I mean, typically food consumption, but what kinds? I mean, we think of bowls with cereal, but that isn't the typical diet.
Their main meal for much of biblical history was simply stew, different kinds of stews. So your grains, your legumes, boiled, and then you could drink them or sip them out of a cup like this.
Okay. Now there is one artifact here that is brick. Well, it's ceramic. We could call it ceramic, but it's important because of the inscription going across the face of it, which is the 10th Legion. So we've got reference here to the 10th Legion. We are going to bump into that in our program as we think about the territory we're going to cover in this particular episode. So, important inscriptions, as well as mostly everyday, maybe kind of running at your end of the table toward the higher end, certainly the more expensive than pottery and ceramics, yes?
That would be the case.
And maybe found more in higher income families. But I've heard that these are used quite well across the socioeconomic scale.
I think the quantity would vary.
It would probably.
And probably some of the finer perfumes, what was in them would.
And maybe
also
the
be
finer quality of some of the jars.
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then let's take a look at some slides and illustrations of our setting, first of all. Then we'll do the chronological setting, then we will do a geographical setting. And although it's not highlighted, my bad on this one, Kent, which of these characters are we going to be thinking about in terms of Jerusalem?
Well, Herod Antipas of Galilee and Perea across the Jordan was the Herod on the scene when Jesus was tried. In fact, his Pilate, trying to remove himself from this predicament, actually, when he realizes Jesus is from Galilee, he says, well, I'll send him to Herod. It would be Antipas. who was the ruler of that region.
So we would have that connection, and that's the Herod that we think about.
Right. He would have been in Jerusalem only because it was the time of Passover. Normally, he wouldn't have been there.
Fair enough, fair enough. Okay, geographically, Kent, I know you love maps. We are thinking about Jerusalem. How does it relate to what's around here and to the stories?
Well, Jerusalem really is the center of point of reference. It's up in the highlands, this purple area down in the center lower part of the map, and runs all the way to the coast. This is the area that the descendants of Herod ceased to control, because this is where the Rome took over direct rule under the procurators or prefects, and Pilate being the one during Jesus' death. But this core area was the biblical center of the kingdom of Israel and Judah. So it includes what had been the tribe of Judah, includes what had been the tribal areas of Ephraim and Manasseh, and then some of the more outlying areas around, but not up past the Jezreel Valley into the Galilee, where we see the green, not across the Jordan River into those territories, and not further to the south, which was now Idumean or under Edomite control.
Kind of the results of the Edomites and the mixing here.
Right.
Kendra, the role of Jerusalem in the gospel, in the Gospels. Now we're going to look at the Gospels and their accounts in a minute, but just in general, where does Jerusalem figure in the story of Jesus as told by our four gospel writers?
You have the sense that that is where Jesus is going. He'll say that halfway through the Gospel of Mark and then repeat it 2 more times. That's also the case with Matthew. With Luke's Gospel, it will say in chapter 9, verse 51, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. He was focused and determined. There'll be a lot of moving around and not going in a straight line to Jerusalem. Lots of activities, healings, etc. But he's headed to Jerusalem. And in the Gospel of John, there will be this, not only will he visit Jerusalem 2 other times before his death, but of course, when it comes close to his arrest and crucifixion, there's this sort of momentum building. In John's Gospel, though, what happens on the cross is Jesus' glorification. That's the moment that he's been waiting for. And it's not a shaming moment like it is in the Synoptic Gospels. It's his moment of glory. If I be lifted up, will draw all people to myself. So it is finished kind of declaration. So the 4 Gospels treat it slightly differently, but definitely Jerusalem is the focal point of the narrative as it's moving.
It does seem that the Gospel of John is taking Jesus to his enthronement.
Yes. I think that's a nice way of saying it.
To the majesty of
victory.
Of victory.
Yeah, this is victory, not defeat.
In fact, it seems to me that people, even though they try to stop him, can't. He's on his way. The Greeks want to talk to him, but no, he's on his way to his enthronement. And Simon of Cyrene doesn't even show up in the Gospel of John.
True.
Jesus is on his way to his enthronement. That's a different way of thinking about Jerusalem, if in fact we're reading all of the Gospels together.
Some might even say that the 7 signs of the first half of the Gospel of John are called signs because they're pointing to Jerusalem and the death of Jesus. That they're not miracles, they're signs. Keep following where he's pointing.
Yes. Okay, then, let's think about the Gospels. And you've talked about these, so I'm going to go past this slide and think about what we have here. The ministry in Jerusalem, and again, we're thinking before the Passion Week. So we have to lock into that. And it looks like we have Luke 2 here, so we could go back to early stories. Right. Certainly the visit by Jesus and his parents. The way I read it, and tell me if I'm correct, there were the annual visits, and it seems to me that Joseph was coming to these annual visits to the temple. Is that how I'm reading, or am I reading too much into it?
We know that from the standpoint of that was a tradition that would have been valuable to Jewish people, especially Jewish men. But the account is not given except in Luke when it comes to Jesus' dedication and when he's 12.
Right.
So that's the only time we hear anything about Jesus between birth and adulthood and the start of his ministry.
So we don't know.
We don't know for sure, no, I don't think.
But Jerusalem and the temple still.
The focal point.
Right.
I think that's right.
Right. And then we have a couple of pools that we will visit.
When we're at those pools, we know we're in Jerusalem.
we know we have arrived. Some of the issues that confront us as we try to think about archaeology and the gospel accounts. The whole business of Roman Judea. I mean, it's, Kent and I spend our time in the Old Testament, and we think about Jerusalem from Old Testament perspectives. This is now something radically new and controlled by and certainly influenced by Rome. Then we have a number of places to visit, streets, pools, something. I don't know, how much could we say, Kent, of Jesus's Jerusalem can we really claim to be able to visit and to see? What kind of percentage would you put on that?
Of the sites mentioned in the New Testament, or of that we were getting?
Yeah, let's start there.
Well, so much of what we're walking through is if we go back, Ottoman, earlier Crusader, we get some still back from the Byzantine, even less Roman. So I would say it's quite minimal what we can actually see. Some of the excavations have uncovered aspects.
And continue.
And continue
to uncover. So there's space for another New Testament archaeologist, Kendra, on one of the teams, I'm sure. We can do that.
Give that some thought.
Okay, that's on your, is that on your bucket list yet, or just a list somewhere?
Standing here between you two, it's a serious contemplation.
No choice in that.
Okay, so we'll look at some connections to those issues. Inscriptions help us immensely. So let's take a look at some of them. Kent, you love inscriptions. What is this inscription about?
This is part of one of the inscriptions. There are a couple that prohibit Gentiles from entering the court of the Jews. And they're informed that if they do, they will be responsible for their own execution, or for bringing that upon them. So it's a rather frank way of telling them don't enter.
This was not the welcoming committee station? This was...
You have to think about the sense of purity. It's something foreign to us. We think how rude, how uninviting. Right. But within that context, the ideas of purity and impurity required someone who is not ritually clean to enter. And for the Gentiles, that was not possible.
No, impossible.
Impossible.
Right.
Our last episode talked about outsiders and Jesus interacting with outsiders. Yes. Given this kind of a backdrop, it makes that interaction of Jesus even more moving. Yeah.
Right. Another inscription, Theodotus, connected with at least a lot of people connect it with the synagogue of the freedmen, and found in Jerusalem, first century, connected with an important, biblically mentioned synagogue. Where does this one come from, Kent?
This is a Roman centurion's tombstone. We find a lot of tombstones, and we can actually learn quite a bit about the soldiers that were appointed to the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Many of them spoke Greek. Their tombstones are in Greek. Some of them were in Latin, having come more from the core area of the Roman Empire. Centurions,
from a biblical scholar's point of view, they do show up in the Gospels.
They do, surprisingly so, given who's writing these Gospels. I immediately think of Matthew 8 and the Roman centurion who invites Jesus to heal his slave, and has the sense that Jesus doesn't even have to physically be there in order to have this happen. I also, of course, think of the Roman centurion who's present at Jesus' death. And it's particularly powerful in the Gospel of Mark when he proclaims at Jesus' death, surely this man was God's son. The very proclamation that God's voice says at the beginning of Mark at Jesus' baptism, a centurion says at Jesus' death. Sort of the beginning and the ending of this incredible ministry. And quite powerful. I've had students make the observation, isn't it interesting that what only God can declare at the beginning of the book, a centurion is able to declare at the end.
Again, giving voice to the outsiders.
Amazing.
People despised, right? I mean, this was the occupying force. This is the occupying power.
Absolutely. And the one that is not only Gentile and unclean, but all the ramifications of the occupiers. These are the ones that have taken over our village, our resources, our natural resources. These are the ones who can demand that your daughter or your son become their slave at any time.
So to give this kind of openness, this kind of connection, this kind of access
Absolutely radical.
is terrific. Another one, actually two inscriptions here. We find Roman mile markers all throughout Israel, Palestine, Jordan.
We do.
Maybe the southern Levant in its entirety. And they mark off distances, don't they? And this one's important because of the name Vespasian on the second line here, and his role in the destruction of Jerusalem.
The second time, well, no, the first time, right after. Well, he had to go back to be emperor, so Titus finished the hands-on work.
Right. And then there's an inscription just above one of the two gates, the two doorways in the south side of the temple structure. That is, of the platform, the temple platform. Here's one from Hadrian, 2nd century, but nevertheless an important figure. And his name shows up as well as architecture dedicated to him all over the southern Levant. The double gate again, the inscription. Now, what is this one? This one was found relatively, well, I guess in the last 15, 20 years, something like that. So what does it say, Kent?
It tumbled from the upper levels of the temple courtyard from a corner, and it has this inscription, says, to the place of trumpeting. We think that's what Josephus was talking about when he describes the priest who would blow the trumpet to indicate the commencement of feast days or the Sabbath, special occasions like that.
So to find an inscription, this got lots of buzz when it was first found, and still does, and it's an important one. Now, the inscription we showed in one of our artifacts here, the 10th Legion. This is the 8th cohort of the 10th Legion. So found in Jerusalem, connecting us with more maybe with the Passion Week than before, but in any case, important. Some artifacts. So let's take a look at some things. Coins. Some people have connected this with Jerusalem, and it may be more translational. I think, Kent, as we've talked about it, it's probably more, should be tied to Gamla in the north. But some people have made the connection with Jerusalem. And it's, again, a translational issue. The Sadducean quarter in Jerusalem, that is the more wealthy place.
It's up on the Western Hill, and you could go across that bridge or causeway right onto the Temple Mount without having to descend into the sort of the common areas of the lower city.
So between the palace of Herod and the temple
That's
complex.
right, just below Herod's palace.
Right. Preserved now in the Wohl Museum, W-O-H-L.
One of the villas is,
Yes.
parts of a couple.
Yes, parts of several. What, 3 maybe coming down? Because you're walking down,
Right.
and this was discovered after 67, after
In the 70s.
And what happened is they excavated, and it was so impressive that the landowners were willing and happy to build. I don't know if they were happy. They're willing to build up on pillars, so they live on a 2nd story of the site. They don't own the property. It's now represented in places that we'll see. This 6th century map of Jerusalem from the town of Madaba, and it doesn't have all of the details we're talking about, but what it does have are details from the 6th century in Jerusalem. 3 churches
3 churches.
that show up here?
There are. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of Zion, where the upper room had been,
Right.
and then what's called the Nea Apse,
So
or the
the
new
new
church.
church. Right. So then let's take a look at some of these images of very fine wear. These were elites, right? So we're talking about people who were doing well. Why were they doing well, and who were they?
Well, these were the families which had come to terms with the Roman administration, shall we say.
Maybe for their own benefit?
They certainly seemed to be satisfied with the status quo. They were not among the agitators who wished to change the situation, get rid of the Romans. And these were many of the priestly families as well. So they were, the Sadducees, these were the administrators, the high priests' families. And we can see from their actual houses the way in which they lived.
If we look at another house, all of this covered over by the property owners and where they are. The one layer removed from the land, but all part of the Wool Museum. And including some, a design here of the house as it goes down, but then as well, some of the fine ware. Kent, you are a specialist with pottery. What is this pottery?
This is terra sigillata. It's a very fine pottery which finds it's it's distributed all across the Roman Empire. Every household which considered them to be of substance had to have terra sigillata, and these of course were smashed when the Romans destroyed the city and the walls fell in, but they've been put back together.
Beautiful, spectacular pottery. Now, a couple of pools. Pool of Bethesda. What are their names? I mean, I've seen.
Yeah. House of the Flowing or House of Mercy, depending on.
So we've got different ways to label it. And I think this locates it nicely, just north of the temple complex and near the Antonia Fortress as well. And preserved here in two structures. And maybe when we look at it, I don't know where one would draw the line for the two structures.
Actually, that's part of the support church for the Crusader Church that was straddling the center causeway.
So that's where they made, that's where we can reconstruct.
Right, so one pool's on this side, one's on the other side.
And so what happens here?
This is that setting for the story in John chapter 5 of the man who for 38 years was by the pool of Bethesda, waiting for the water to stir up.
Right.
And of course, the living water comes and helps him stand up.
It's really quite powerful to go to a place like this with that story in your mind. Like the well in Sychar, when you think about the story of the woman at the well. Another image here, again, quite far down to the bottom here. And then the other pool is the Pool of Siloam, located at the end of what, at least in earlier times, was called the City of David.
Right, so the outflow of the Gihon Spring cuts through, and this is, there we are, this is part of the tunnel, and then the water flows downhill to the south. And the King's Garden, this is the, well, we now know it's the medieval Siloam Pool. The one in Jesus' time is a little further downhill.
So I put this in quotation marks because it was called that for a long time.
It's been called that for a long time.
And then if we really go to the right place, it's down here.
And
And
of
not
course,
only partially excavated.
and John 9. And the man who's been blind since birth is told to wash the mud that Jesus placed there.
I mean, going there, reading the story, and if you do it at the same time, it's extremely moving. I mean, that's going past the science of archaeology. That's going to some emotive layers, some right brain sorts of responses. And then the southern wall of the temple, where we have some other indications of activity, some of which, in fact, the one on the double doors on the left is what we'd seen before and have been connecting it with archaeology. Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We hope this has been helpful to you in growing in faith and in knowledge, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.